Grand Admiral Thesic Vor had conquered 11 worlds, and he had never once needed to look at a tactical display for longer than it took to confirm what he already knew. He did not look long now either. The bridge of the Ashbringer's vanguard hummed with the low, satisfied murmur of a crew that had done this before, not this exact thing, never this exact world, but this kind of thing, enough times that the rituals of conquest had worn smooth and easy, like river stones. Sol's system unspooled before them on the deck's central holotank. A yellow star, 8 worlds of varying uselessness, and one blue-green anomaly currently broadcasting more electromagnetic noise into the void than any of the previous 11 species combined. Thesic found that noise almost endearing. Radio dramas. Faint television signals bouncing off the ionosphere, decades stale by the time they reached deep space, full of primitive theatrics about monsters and heroes. Military bands chattering in encryption his cryptographic core had cracked in under 4 minutes, and then, almost insultingly, apologized for how easy it had been. "Report," Thesic said, because it was expected, not because he needed it. Commander Ayers Kethu straightened at the tactical station. She was young for her rank, sharp-eyed, the kind of officer who read appendices nobody else bothered with. "Population approximately 8 billion, sir. Industrial capacity is planetary, not orbital. They haven't moved heavy manufacturing off-world. No detected energy weapons above conventional explosive yield. Their most advanced military satellites are." She paused, double-checking the number because it seemed too small to say aloud. "Unarmed." As expected, Thesic allowed himself the smallest curl of satisfaction. 11 worlds, and this one might be the easiest yet. No orbital defense grid to dismantle, no fleet to draw out and bait into a killing field. Just a species that had, by every visible metric, not yet realized it needed to be afraid. He had read the Velkari conquest doctrine so many times he could recite it in his sleep, and had, more than once, to junior officers who needed reminding. Demonstrate, don't devastate. A single strike, surgical and terrifying, aimed at nothing populated, designed purely to communicate the mathematics of the situation to a species too young to have run the numbers themselves. Show them what could happen. Let their own imagination do the rest. It was, in Thesic's professional opinion, the most elegant weapon in the Imperial arsenal, restraint, deployed as a threat. "Target coordinates," he said. "The desert region, northern hemisphere, the one their own maps call Atacama, uninhabited, visible from 3 of their primary population centers' atmospheric sensors if they have any worth the name." "Targeting now, sir." Iris's hands moved across her console, and Thesic watched the long, slow charge of the primary kinetic lance begin its climb on the secondary display, a clean, confident curve, the kind of readout that had preceded 11 surrenders. It was Ayers who hesitated fractionally before the final confirmation. "Sir, may I note something for the log, before we fire?" Thesic glanced at her. She had a habit of doing this, flagging procedural concerns nobody else thought worth voicing, and he had a habit of allowing it, mostly because she was usually right about small things and never right about anything that mattered. "Quickly." Their broadcast traffic includes references, fragmentary, decades old, to something found near their 4th largest moon, not their moon, one of the outer system moons, Jupiter they call it. She frowned at her own readout as if she weren't sure why she was bringing it up. There's a thread of correspondence, scientific, not military, about a relay or artifact recovered there 40 of their years ago. The references stop abruptly. No further public mention. Humans burying an inconvenient discovery is hardly unprecedented behavior for a young species, Thesic said. If it concerned us, the Severni precursor archives would have flagged it during deep scan. "The Severni archives are incomplete, sir. We've always known that." "Noted for the log, Commander, filed under irrelevant." Thesic allowed the words a touch of warmth, the kind a senior officer affords a promising subordinate being slightly too thorough. "Fire when ready." Iris's mouth tightened, but she nodded, because that was the job and because Thesic would reflect on this later, when there was time to reflect on anything at all. She had never actually disobeyed an order in her career, only flagged the ones she disagreed with and then executed them anyway, with the same professional precision as everyone else. The lance fired. It traveled the way these things always traveled, a silent, invisible lance of compressed kinetic energy, accelerated past anything a primitive species could intercept or even properly perceive, until the moment of impact. Thesic watched the secondary display tick down the seconds to atmospheric entry with the mild, pleasant anticipation of a man watching a familiar play reach its expected climax. 3, 2, 1. Impact. The desert lit up on infrared like a struck match, a clean, brilliant flash, exactly the yield the simulations had predicted, exactly the crater diameter the doctrine manual specified for demonstration without provocation. Cheers, restrained and professional, rippled through the bridge crew. 11 worlds, now likely 12. Thesic allowed himself a full breath of satisfaction before the first error message appeared. It was small, almost polite, in the way that ship systems tried to be polite when delivering bad news to commanding officers. A single line in the secondary display, beneath the otherwise perfect impact telemetry. Anomalous return signal DETECTED, origin. Impact site trajectory, inbound following original firing vector in reverse. Thesic stared at it for nearly 4 full seconds before he understood what it was telling him, and even then, he did not yet understand what it meant. "Explain," Thesic said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his voice did not carry the easy authority of a man certain of the answer before he'd finished asking the question. Iris was already working the problem, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by the focused stillness of an officer who has just watched the universe disagree with established doctrine. "The kinetic lance discharged correctly, sir. Impact yield matches projections within margin of error, but something came back." "Something cannot come back. Kinetic energy converts to heat, light, displaced matter. It does not return." "I'm aware that it shouldn't, sir." She pulled the raw sensor log up on the main display, the numbers scrolling faster than even Velkari eyes could comfortably track, until she froze it on a single frame. "Here, at the moment of impact, energy dissipation begins exactly as modeled for 140 milliseconds. Then it stops, not decays, stops, and then this." A new waveform bloomed across the display, a tight, structured pulse, nothing like the chaotic afterglow of a kinetic strike. It had shape. It had intention in the way that only engineered signals had intention, the kind of clean geometric signature that came from something built, not something that simply happened. "It's not a weapon discharge," Iyer said slowly, as if she didn't quite believe her own conclusion even as she stated it. "It's structured like a response, like something answering the strike." Thesic leaned over her station, close enough that the junior officer beside her shifted uncomfortably out of the way. He studied the waveform with the particular intensity of a man trying to force an answer to make sense through sheer force of rank. "Velkari weapon systems do not produce structured response signatures. Are you suggesting the humans did this? With unarmed orbital infrastructure and radio band military communications?" "No, sir, I don't think the humans did this at all." Iris's voice had dropped, the way it did when she was thinking faster than she could comfortably speak. "I think something responded to the strike, the way you'd respond to a knock at a door, something that was already there, waiting." It was, Thesic would later admit to himself in the privacy of his own quarters, the precise moment he should have ordered a full system-wide alert, recalled all forward sensor arrays, and treated the anomaly as a credible unknown threat rather than a curiosity to be filed and forgotten. It was also the precise moment that 30 years of unbroken conquest, 11 worlds, 11 surrenders, 11 demonstrations of Velkari superiority executed exactly to doctrine made that course of action feel almost beneath him. "Run a full diagnostic on the lance itself," he said instead. "I want confirmation this isn't an internal malfunction misread as an external signal." "Already running, sir. Preliminary results say the weapon is fully operational. No fault detected." "Then it's atmospheric interference. This world has weather patterns and ionospheric density we haven't fully modeled. Strange echoes are not unprecedented in unfamiliar atmospheres." Ayers did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched a half-second longer than was comfortable for a tactical officer reporting to her admiral. "With respect, sir, atmospheric interference doesn't produce structured signal geometry. It produces noise. This had shape." "Noted for the log, Commander." It was the second time he'd said those exact words to her in under 10 minutes, and something about repeating himself, about hearing his own dismissal echo back at him, almost as cleanly as whatever had echoed back from that desert impact site, needled at him in a way he did not examine closely enough to name. He turned from the tactical station and addressed the bridge at large, raising his voice to the register that ended discussion and began action. "Helm, hold position. Communications, prepare the standard post-demonstration broadcast. Full translation packages for every major human language cluster. Surrender terms, the usual." "Should we expect a response within the hour, sir?" The young communications officer, eager, clearly hopping for a clean answer to bring the bridge's mood back to its earlier, comfortable confidence. "We should expect a response within the hour," Thesick said, and meant it, because in 11 prior campaigns, fear had always arrived on schedule. Fear was, in his experience, the most reliable thing about young species. You showed them a fraction of what you were capable of, and the rest filled in by itself, faster and more thoroughly than any actual demonstration ever could. The broadcast went out. The bridge waited. The clock that had governed 11 previous conquests began, once again, its familiar countdown toward the moment a planet's leadership realized resistance was already over before it had properly begun. But Ayers kept the anomalous waveform open on her secondary display, off to the side where her admiral wouldn't notice her still watching it, and she did not stop watching it for the rest of her shift. There was something in its clean, deliberate structure that nagged at a memory she couldn't quite place, something from her academy years, a dense, half-remembered lecture on extinct precursor civilizations and the strange, inexplicable artifacts they sometimes left behind. She filed the feeling away as unease rather than evidence, because unease was not something you could put in a tactical report. She was professionally required to be right about things she could prove. She would spend the next several hours being quietly, unbearably right about something she couldn't prove at all, not until it was far too late for anyone on the bridge to do anything but watch. The response did not come within the hour. It did not come within 6 hours or 12, and by the time a full Sol Standard day had passed in silence, the mood on the Vanguard's bridge had curdled from confident anticipation into something none of the crew had a comfortable name for. Thesick told himself, repeatedly, that this was simply a young species processing trauma at an unfamiliar pace. Perhaps their governmental structures were too fractured to produce a unified surrender quickly. Perhaps they were arguing among themselves about who had the authority to capitulate on behalf of the whole world. What he did not tell himself, because it would have meant admitting Ayers's earlier instinct deserved more weight than he'd given it, was that the silence didn't feel like panic. He had conquered enough worlds to know the particular texture of a planet in genuine crisis, the chaotic spikes in communication traffic, the scrambling military assets repositioning without clear strategy, the desperate, overlapping broadcasts on every frequency as different factions tried to negotiate simultaneously and contradictorily. He had seen that texture 11 times. He was watching for it now, and it was not there. Instead, Earth's communication simply narrowed. Civilian broadcast traffic dropped to a fraction of its previous volume within the first 2 hours, not chaotically, but in a manner that looked, to Thesic's increasingly uneasy eye, almost coordinated. Military channels went encrypted at a level of sophistication that hadn't been present the day before, not panic scrambling, but a clean, practiced transition, like a drill that had been run many times before and was simply being executed once more, for real. "They're not panicking," Ayer said, voicing the thing Thesic had been avoiding saying aloud. "They're following a procedure." "A procedure for what? Surrender doesn't require encryption upgrades." "No, sir, it doesn't." Far below them, unseen by any Velkari sensor sophisticated enough to parse the difference between fear and discipline, humanity was doing something it had quietly rehearsed, in classified briefings and contingency protocols, for nearly 4 decades. Ever since a deep space research vessel, the Magellan IV, had drifted close enough to one of Jupiter's lesser moons to intercept a transmission that should not have existed. In a windowless facility, 11 stories beneath a nondescript government campus outside Geneva, Dr. Naomi Ape stood in front of a wall of monitors that had, until 6 hours ago, displayed nothing more dramatic than routine deep space telemetry. Now they displayed something her division had hoped, quietly, fervently, for 40 years. They would never have to look at outside of a training simulation. "Confirm status," she said, and her voice was steady in the particular way that voices become steady only through extensive, deliberate practice at not sounding afraid. "Status confirmed," replied Colonel Yusuf Demir, her counterpart from the Joint Operations side of the program, a man who had spent half his career preparing for a contingency he privately suspected would never actually trigger in his lifetime. "Velkari Fleet signature matches the Magellan archive profile, 94% confidence. They fired once, Atacama site, yield consistent with what the archive called a demonstration discharge. And the response? Triggered automatically the moment the strike registered, exactly like the archive said it would. We didn't have to do anything." Demir's jaw was tight. "Naomi, it worked exactly the way the dead species notes said it would work, which means everything else in those notes is probably true too." Naomi did not answer immediately. She was looking at a different screen, one displaying not Velkari fleet telemetry, but the original archive transmission itself. The one her predecessor, decades dead now, had first decoded from a derelict relay drifting silent and broken near Jupiter, transmitting on a long, slow loop to anyone who might one day be capable of receiving it. She had read the translated text more times than she could count. She still found herself reading it again now, as if rereading it might somehow change what it asked of the people who'd inherited it. "We are the last of the Severni. We could not save our worlds. We leave this safeguard for whoever finds it next, with one condition we cannot enforce except through your own conscience. Do not use this to conquer, only to refuse conquest. If you take up the sword instead of the shield, the gift becomes nothing more than what destroyed us." 40 years of internal debate had gone into that single condition. 40 years of generals who wanted to weaponize the relay's principles immediately, of ethicists who argued the technology should never be activated at all, of careful, grinding compromise that had resulted, eventually, in exactly one policy: do nothing, until something forces the field active on its own terms, defensively, exactly as the Severni intended. "They have no idea what they just woke up," Naomi said quietly. "No," Demir agreed. "And we're about to find out if 40 years of guessing about how it actually works was worth anything at all." Above them, far beyond the atmosphere, the vanguard held position, broadcasting surrender terms into a silence that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a species that had, decades ago, made a choice it hadn't been sure it would ever need to honor. By the start of the second day, Thesic's patience had curdled into something closer to professional offense. 11 worlds had taught him many things, and chief among them was this: Silence that did not resolve into surrender within a reasonable window was not caution. It was defiance. And defiance, in the Velkari doctrine he had spent his career enforcing, required escalation. "They've mistaken restraint for hesitation," he told his assembled senior officers, packing the small length of the strategy chamber with the controlled energy of a man channeling frustration into purpose. "We gave them a demonstration. They have responded with silence and military encryption upgrades. That is not the behavior of a species preparing to surrender. That is the behavior of a species preparing to resist." "Or stalling, sir," offered his second-in-command, a broad, taciturn officer named Goreth who rarely spoke unless the strategic picture genuinely warranted it. "Buying time to consolidate command structure." "Either way, the response is the same." Thesic stopped packing. "We escalate, not to the level of planetary devastation, not yet, but enough to remove any ambiguity about what continued silence will cost them. Orbital infrastructure, their unarmed satellites, their communication relays. Strip away their ability to coordinate a unified response, and the surrender will follow within hours." Ayers, seated at the end of the table, said nothing for a long moment, long enough that Thesic noticed. "Commander, you disagree." "I have a recommendation, sir, not a disagreement." She chose her words with the particular care of someone who had already had 2 suggestions dismissed in the last day and didn't intend to waste a third. "Before we fire again, I'd like authorization to run a full diagnostic on the Lance system specifically targeting whatever produced that anomalous return signal. If there's an unknown variable in play, I'd rather understand it before we test it twice." The Lance diagnostics from the first strike showed full functionality. "They showed the weapon was functional, sir. They didn't explain what happened after the weapon fired correctly. I don't think those are the same question." Thesic considered her for a moment, really considered her, the way he hadn't quite allowed himself to in the rush of the last day, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he respected the persistence even as he overruled it. "Your diagnostic can run in parallel with the strike, Commander. We are not delaying further. Every hour of silence we permit is an hour their command structure uses to prepare countermeasures we currently know nothing about. The fastest path to safety is the fastest path to their surrender." It was, by every metric of Velkari military doctrine accumulated over 11 prior campaigns, the correct call. Thesic believed that completely, with the kind of certainty that came from a career built entirely on that doctrine working exactly as designed, every single time, without exception. The strike order went out within the hour. This time, no single demonstration shot, a coordinated volley from 6 of the Vanguard's secondary batteries, targeting the cluster of human communication satellites in geostationary orbit, plus 2 military command and control installations whose locations Velkari signals intelligence had triangulated from the previous day's encrypted traffic. Surgical, doctrine compliant. Designed to blind and confuse, not to kill at scale, escalation with restraint, the same elegant logic that had worked 11 times before. The weapons charged. Thesic watched the targeting display tick through its familiar countdown, the same clean curve he'd watched a day earlier in the moments before everything had gone strange. The firing solution resolved, the discharge command executed. And then, across all 6 batteries simultaneously, the tactical display reported something that made the entire bridge crew go very still. "Discharge complete." No flash. No outbound energy signature, no impact telemetry from the targeted satellites because nothing had actually traveled toward them. The weapons systems, every diagnostic insisted, had fired exactly as commanded: full power draw, full capacitor discharge, every internal sensor confirming a completed firing sequence, and yet nothing had left the ship. The energy that should have launched outward had simply returned. Folded back into the same capacitor arrays it had come from, as smoothly and silently as if it had never left at all. "Status," Thesic said, and this time his voice had lost every trace of the easy authority it had carried only a day before. "All 6 batteries report nominal post-discharge status," said the weapons officer, staring at his console as though it might change its answer if he looked hard enough. "Capacitors fully recharged, sir. Instantaneously. There's no damage, no malfunction code, nothing. The weapons think they fired successfully. They're just—" He searched for a word that didn't exist in standard Valkyrie tactical vocabulary. "They're just not letting it go." Iris was already at her station, pulling the diagnostic she'd been denied authorization to run in time, watching the same clean, structured waveform from the Desert Strike bloom across all 6 weapon systems at once. Not a malfunction, not interference, but a deliberate, coordinated, identical response, scaled instantly to match 6 simultaneous discharges instead of 1. "Try again," Thesic ordered, because some part of him still believed, with the stubbornness of a man who had never once needed to revise his doctrine across 11 campaigns, that this was a glitch that would resolve itself on a second attempt. "Single battery, minimum yield. Confirm the weapon can fire at all." The order executed, the capacitor charged, the discharge command fired. "Discharge complete." Nothing left the ship. On the bridge of the Ashbringer's Vanguard, in the silence that followed, Grand Admiral Thesic Vor finally understood, with the slow, cold clarity of a man watching his entire career's worth of certainty dissolve in real time, that he was not looking at a malfunction. He was looking at a wall, and it had been built, deliberately, exactly the height of whatever he chose to throw at it. The strategy chamber that had, hours earlier, hummed with the confident energy of officers planning an escalation now sat in a silence Thesic found almost physically uncomfortable. 6 weapon systems, full diagnostic clearance, and not one of them could explain why the Vanguard's guns had simply declined, twice now, to do the one thing they had been built to do. "I want to revisit Commander Kethu's diagnostic request," Thesic said finally, and the words cost him something to say, an admission folded carefully inside a procedural request so it wouldn't sound like the apology it almost was. "Commander, you said you recognized something about that return signature. Academy material, you said." Iris had already pulled the file before he finished asking. She'd been pulling at the edges of the memory for the better part of a day, and the moment the weapons had locked a second time, the last piece had finally clicked into place hard enough to chase down properly. She set her data terminal on the table and turned it so the assembled officers could see. "Severni Precursor Archive," she said. "Appendix material, the kind nobody reads outside of advanced xenoarchaeology electives. Most of what we know about the Severni is fragments. They were extinct roughly 100,000 years before the Empire ever achieved sublight travel. Whatever destroyed them did so completely. No surviving colonies, no surviving technology recovered intact, no direct contact ever logged with a living Severni by any species in our historical record." She tapped the terminal, and the structured waveform from the Desert Strike bloomed onto the shared display, sitting now beside an almost identical waveform pulled from the archive file, decades old, theoretical, labeled only as a reconstructed hypothesis. Except this: the archive calls it a reciprocity principle. Theorized, never confirmed, because no intact example had ever been found or activated in recorded Valkyrie history, until approximately 30 hours ago. Goreth leaned forward, frowning at the matched waveforms. "Explain what it actually does, not what it's called." "It's not a weapon," Iris said, and that single sentence seemed to cost the room more than anything else she'd said. "That's the part the old file gets wrong, or at least incomplete. A weapon destroys. This doesn't destroy anything, it returns exactly what's offered to it once as a warning. Our first strike hit an empty desert. Its response was structural, almost gentle, a return signal, nothing more, like a held breath. We escalated to 6 simultaneous strikes against actual targets, and it didn't destroy our weapons or our ships. It simply declined to let the violence leave our side of the equation a second time, permanently as far as the archive theorizes, Once a reciprocity field activates against an aggressor, that aggressor's capacity for offensive action against the protected target is locked, not destroyed, not punished, just refused. Thesick absorbed this with the particular stillness of a man, recalculating every assumption that had brought him to this system in the first place. You're telling me Earth has access to 100,000-year-old precursor technology that no Velkari force has ever successfully countered, because no Velkari force has ever successfully triggered one before. I'm telling you Earth probably didn't build it, sir. I don't think they could have. The archive is clear that no species without already significant grasp of Severny-era physics could replicate this independently, and human technological signatures are nowhere close to that level. Iris paused, and when she continued, her voice had dropped into the register of someone voicing a conclusion she didn't want to be correct about. I think they found it. The way the appendix theorizes other species might eventually, scattered across the galaxy in dead Severny relay caches, waiting for whoever stumbles across one next. I think Earth has been sitting on a Severny legacy system for longer than we've known this world existed, and they never used it offensively, not once, in all the decades they apparently knew it was there, which means either they were never tempted to, or something stopped them from being tempted, Thesick finished quietly, the same way it just stopped us. The chamber went very quiet. 11 worlds. 11 campaigns built on the doctrine that overwhelming demonstrated force always, eventually, produced surrender, because every species the Velkari had ever encountered had, at the bottom of their capability, a ceiling the Empire could exceed. Thesick had never once considered what doctrine looked like against a species that hadn't needed a ceiling of their own, because something far older and far more patient had quietly agreed to be the ceiling on their behalf, and only on the precise, narrow condition that it never be used to reach upward, only to hold a line. If the theory is correct, Iris continued, the field doesn't care about scale. 6 batteries, 1 battery, the entire fleet's main armament. The response will be the same because it isn't measuring our firepower. It's measuring intent. The moment we commit to offensive action against the protected target, the action simply doesn't complete. We could empty every magazine on every ship in this fleet at Earth right now, sir, and I don't believe a single shot would actually leave Velkari hulls. Then we are not facing a defended world, Thesick said slowly. We are facing a world that cannot, by any military calculation available to us, be invaded at all. Not won, not lost, simply removed from the category of worlds that can be fought over. No one in the chamber disagreed. For the first time in 11 campaigns, Thesick found himself entirely without a doctrine to fall back on, because every doctrine he had ever been trained in assumed, as its first and most fundamental axiom, that sufficient force could always eventually overcome sufficient resistance. The Severny, dead 100,000 years and unable to defend so much as a single moon of their own, had apparently built something that quietly, permanently, broke that axiom for whoever they chose to leave it to. Get me a channel to whoever speaks for that planet, Thesick said. Not a surrender broadcast, a parley request. I want to understand exactly what we triggered and exactly what it will take to make sure it never triggers against the Empire again anywhere, against anyone. It was, Iris thought, watching her admiral's face settle into an expression she had never once seen on him in 3 years of service, something between humility and genuine fear. Possibly the first entirely correct decision the Vanguard had made since entering Sol's system. The parley request reached Dr. Naomi Ake's desk, encrypted in a Velkari diplomatic format her division had spent 4 decades preparing translation protocols for, and had never, until this exact moment, actually needed to use. They want to talk, Colonel Demir said, reading over her shoulder. Not negotiate terms, understand. Look at the phrasing, they're not asking what we want. They're asking what we did. Because they don't know, Naomi said. They genuinely don't know. They've spent 30 hours assuming we built a weapon system capable of disarming their fleet, and the truth is so much smaller and so much stranger than that. I'm honestly not sure which version frightens them more. The response protocol had been drafted decades ago, revised by 3 successive administrations, argued over by ethicists and generals who agreed on almost nothing except the conviction that if this day ever comes, the explanation matters more than the outcome. Naomi had read that protocol so many times it no longer felt like a document. It felt like something closer to scripture, inherited rather than written. She activated the response channel herself, because the program's founding charter specified that whoever first authorized first contact under this protocol would be a civilian, not a soldier, a deliberate choice, made by people who understood exactly what kind of message it sent to have a scientist, not a general, deliver the explanation. "Grand Admiral," she said, once the translation handshake completed and she could see, for the first time, the face of the man whose fleet had just learned the most expensive lesson of its existence. "My name is Dr. Naomi Ape. I understand you have questions about what happened to your weapon systems." Thesic's image on the display studied her for a long moment, sizing her up, she realized, the way a predator sizes up something it can no longer be certain is prey. "I have one question, Doctor. What is Earth?" "Earth is a planet that found something it didn't build decades ago and made a choice about what to do with it." Naomi had rehearsed this explanation more times in training simulations than she could count, and it still felt strange leaving her mouth in a real conversation. 40 years ago, a research vessel recovered a derelict relay near Jupiter. It had been drifting, broken, transmitting on a long, slow loop for longer than human civilization has existed in its current form. We translated what we could. Most of the relay systems were inert beyond recovery. One system was not. The reciprocity field. You already have a name for it. That tells me your archives are more complete than ours were. She allowed herself the smallest, humanizing admission of uncertainty. "We didn't fully understand what we'd found either, Admiral. We still don't, not completely. What we understood well enough to act on was a message, a kind of final instruction, left by whoever built it, the species your archives apparently call the Severni. They didn't survive whatever destroyed them. But they built one thing that did, and they left it with one condition attached, which we have spent 4 decades treating as close to absolute law." "What condition?" "That it never be used to conquer, only to refuse conquest." Naomi let that sit for a moment, watching the Velkari Admiral's expression on the display, something complicated moving behind his composure, not quite disbelief, not quite something else. "We had every opportunity over 4 decades to study that field, weaponize whatever principles we could extract from it, build something offensive out of a system that was explicitly defensive in design. There were people in my own government who argued exactly for that, more than once. We didn't do it. Not because we're more virtuous than any other species facing that temptation, Admiral. I want to be honest with you about that. But because the people who found the relay first understood something the rest of us eventually came to agree with. If you take a gift built specifically to prevent conquest and turn it into a tool for conquest, you've already failed the only test that mattered, and there's no version of that failure that doesn't eventually come back around on you. And so you simply waited. We waited for exactly this, a species that would test it for us so we'd never have to test it ourselves. It wasn't unkind the way she said it, but it wasn't soft either. You fired the shot that activated it, Admiral, not us. We never armed it. We never aimed it. We built nothing. We inherited a sleeping system from a dead civilization, and the only choice we ever actively made was the choice not to wake it up ourselves." Thesic was quiet for long enough that Naomi began to wonder if the translation link had degraded. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the clipped, formal cadence of a conquering admiral and settled into something closer to genuine, exhausted curiosity. 11 worlds, Doctor. 11 campaigns, executed exactly to doctrine, with results I could have predicted before the first shot was ever fired. I have never once in my entire career encountered a species that simply declined the entire premise of the conflict, not won it, not lost it, declined it. I imagine that's a strange thing to face for the first time. It is a humiliating thing to face for the first time, Thesick said, with a candor that surprised even him. But I find, Doctor, that I would rather be humiliated by a species that built nothing and chose well, than victorious over 10 more that built everything and chose poorly. It was, Naomi thought, watching the Admiral's image hold steady on the display, possibly the most honest sentence anyone representing the Velkari Empire had spoken since entering Sol's system, and very probably not one his superiors would ever be told he'd said. News of the Vanguard's failed second strike reached the Velkari Imperial Court 11 days later, carried not by Thesick's own report, which he filed honestly, in full, knowing exactly what it would cost him, but by a parallel transmission from a court observer embedded in his fleet, whose job had always been to report independently of whichever admiral she was assigned to watch. The court's first instinct, as it had been for 3 centuries of unbroken conquest, was disbelief. The second instinct, once disbelief proved untenable against the observer's corroborated sensor logs, was a quiet, escalating panic that moved through the upper echelons of Velkari military command with the particular speed reserved for problems too large to solve and too dangerous to ignore. 3 additional fleets were quietly redirected toward Sol's system over the following months, not announced as reinforcements, never framed publicly as anything other than routine verification deployments. Because no admiral in the Imperial Navy wanted their name attached to the phrase, "We sent more ships to confirm, we still cannot fire on this planet." Each fleet on arrival ran its own independent tests, hopping, as institutions facing an unbearable new fact always hope, that the previous result had been some unique failure specific to the Vanguard, some flaw in Thesick's command rather than a fundamental law the universe had just quietly revealed. Each fleet got the identical result: weapons charged, weapons discharged according to every internal diagnostic, nothing left the ship. Ayers, reassigned in the aftermath, not demoted exactly, but shifted sideways into a newly created and deeply unglamorous post the court was calling, with bureaucratic understatement, the Office of Precursor Risk Assessment, found herself, 4 months later, briefing increasingly senior officers on a phenomenon she had first flagged from a junior tactical station and been overruled on twice before anyone listened. There was no satisfaction in being right this late. Mostly there was exhaustion and a steadily growing dread that came from understanding the problem better than anyone else in the Empire, and discovering that understanding it didn't make it any less terrifying. The reach of the field isn't confined to a single fleet's local engagement, she told the assembled Strategic Council, 3 months into a study that had consumed her every waking hour. We confirmed this with the 3rd verification deployment, a ship that had never engaged Sol's system before, that approached from an entirely different vector, with no prior contact, found its weapons locked the instant it formally targeted anything within the system. It isn't reacting to us specifically, or to the Vanguard specifically. It's reacting to intent toward Earth, full stop, regardless of which Velkari hull carries that intent. A senior fleet commander, a man with 4 campaigns to his name and considerably less patience for unwelcome physics than Thesick had eventually developed, leaned forward with visible frustration. Then we overwhelm it. Mass deployment, full Imperial Navy commitment, more ships than the field has ever had to account for simultaneously. With respect, Fleet Commander, the field doesn't appear to scale its response based on the size of the threat, Ayers said, with the particular calm of someone who had explained this exact misunderstanding many times already and expected to explain it many more. 6 batteries failed exactly as completely as 1. The theoretical models in the Severny archive, which I'd remind the council we dismissed as unconfirmed speculation for over a century, suggests the field measure's commitment to violence, not capacity for violence. It doesn't care how many ships you bring. It cares whether you intend to use them against the protected target. The entire Imperial Navy could surround Sol's system tomorrow, and I would expect precisely the same result we've already confirmed 4 times over. The silence that followed was the particular silence of an empire built on 3 centuries of one specific, reliable doctrine discovering, in real time, that the doctrine had a hard edge it had simply never previously encountered. And worse, that the edge wasn't a defense the empire could eventually grind down through patience or escalation, because it wasn't measuring the things patience and escalation were good at overcoming. "Then what do you recommend, Commander Kethu?" The question came from the council's presiding officer, and it carried none of the dismissive weight such questions had once carried when she'd first raised concerns on the Vanguard's bridge. "Withdrawal, full and permanent, with no further verification attempts," Ayers said. "Every test deployment we send confirms the same result and costs us nothing except dignity, so far. I cannot guarantee that remains true indefinitely, and I would strongly advise against testing how patient a 100,000-year-old failsafe actually is. More urgently, Council, if the Severni left one of these systems for Earth to inherit, the archive strongly implies multiple relays were distributed, likely to multiple species, possibly throughout this entire region of the galaxy. I recommend the Empire's priority shift immediately from conquest doctrine to detection doctrine. We need to know which other worlds might be holding something we cannot afford to test against twice." The Council's eventual decision, reached after weeks of debate that never fully escaped the institutional discomfort of admitting defeat without ever quite using that word, was withdrawal, quiet, undocumented in any public Imperial record, with every officer who had witnessed the Vanguard's failed strike bound by a confidentiality order that would hold, more or less successfully, for several years before the story began leaking out anyway. The way true stories of genuine institutional humiliation always eventually do. The Vanguard left Sol's system on a quiet morning that nobody on Earth's surface would ever know was historically significant, slipping back out past the orbit of Mars with the particular silence of a fleet that had nothing left to say and no good way to say it even if it had. Thesic gave the order to depart himself, standing at the same tactical station where Ayers had once flagged a concern he dismissed twice, and found that the view of the retreating blue-green planet on the display felt less like a defeat now than something closer to relief. The strange, unfamiliar relief of a man who had nearly done something irreversible and had been stopped, gently, before he could. He filed his final report honestly, knowing it would end his career advancement entirely and accepting that cost without complaint, because 11 worlds had taught him many things about conquest, and one world had taught him, finally and more thoroughly, something about its limits. The Vanguard's weapon systems, the report noted in careful, technical language, remained permanently unable to discharge against any target within Sol's system, a fact that would be tested, quietly and unsuccessfully, by every Velkari vessel that ever approached the system again, for as long as the Empire's records continued to track such things. On Earth, there was no parade. Dr. Naomi Ake closed her division's active file on the incident 8 months later, in a small, unceremonious meeting attended by people who had spent 40 years preparing for a day the rest of the planet would never know had happened. The public explanation for the unusual radio silence and brief military alert posture of that week, when pressed by the handful of journalists who'd noticed anything at all, was a vague, plausible reference to a satellite communications malfunction. Close enough to true that nobody felt the need to dig further. Far enough from true that the actual story stayed exactly where the program's charter had always intended it to stay. Hidden, not from shame, but from the simple, hard-won wisdom that some kinds of power are safer when very few people know they exist at all. Kethu spent the following years as the empire's reluctant leading expert on precursor failsafes, building, piece by careful piece, a detection doctrine the council had been forced to admit it desperately needed. She never returned to active fleet command, and never particularly wanted to. There was a kind of grim satisfaction in being the person who finally got listened to, even if the cost of being listened to had been watching an entire war doctrine collapse in real time. She thought, sometimes, about the inscription Thesic had mentioned finding buried in the Severni relay's final translated fragment, the one the cryptographic core had decoded too late to change anything, the one Thesic had quoted to her once, quietly, in the strange, candid weeks after the withdrawal order came through, before he'd been formally reassigned, and she'd lost the easy access to his counsel. She'd come to rely on more than she expected to. We could not stay to defend the ones who survive us, so we left them no need of defense at all. She thought about how strange it was that a species dead for 100,000 years had managed something the entire Velkari military doctrine, 3 centuries deep and 11 worlds proven, had never once considered as a goal worth pursuing. Not winning wars, but making certain particular wars never needed to be fought. Earth, for its part, simply continued. Children went to school. Markets opened and closed. News cycles moved on to smaller, more immediate concerns, the way news cycles always do, blissfully unaware that the planet's continued existence in anything like its current form had, for one quiet week, depended entirely on a choice made decades earlier by people who'd had every reason to be tempted otherwise and had chosen, against considerable institutional pressure, not to be. Somewhere above the atmosphere, in the patient, empty dark between worlds, whatever remained of the Severni relay systems settled back into the long, undisturbed sleep it had occupied for 40 years before, quiet, watchful, and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone ever thanked it, because it hadn't been built to be thanked. It had been built to make sure it never had to do anything at all.